Here, Peter Ferrara is the author. This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
My name is Baline. I'm the events director here at Kramerbooks, and it's really my pleasure to welcome you and to welcome Randy tonight for his book, Blood Brothers. Randy is a distinguished professor of history at Purdue University. He's written biographies of iconic athletes and celebrities. He specializes in U.S. history, U.S. sports history, and the history of popular culture, which clearly combine in this new book. The Blood Brothers, the fatal friendship between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, is really the first book to offer an in-depth portrait of their complex friendship, and it really goes deep and uses previously untapped resources from FBI records to personal documents. And so we're so pleased to have Randy here today. And we're really glad that Randy is joined tonight by Kojo Nnamdi. Kojo is the host of the Kojo Nnamdi Show, a live talk show produced by WAMU 88.5 that airs on weekdays at noon. On Fridays at noon, Kojo hosts the Politics Hour on WAMU. Working as a journalist in the district since the 70s at multiple media outlets, Kojo has been dubbed, quote, the Washingtonian of the Year by Washingtonian Magazine, and it has been listed among the district's most influential people by that publication, Washingtonian, and by DCist. We're so glad that Kojo could join us tonight. This is one of our many partner events with WAMU 88.5, our local NPR station. We are so pleased to partner with WAMU. They share so many of our values of bringing community together, having great discussions, and having great conversations and asking wonderful questions. So we're so glad that WAMU can be here in our community and here tonight in the bookstore. Thank you again so much for coming, everybody. Please join me in welcoming Randy Roberts and Kojo Nnamdi to Kramerbooks.
Thank you so very much, Sarah, and thank you all for showing up on what's clearly a dark and stormy night. If you've been to Bermuda, you know that's a drink also. You can get a dark and stormy. Tonight would be a good night for a dark and stormy. Before we get started with tonight's events, I'd just like not only to thank Sarah and the whole staff here at Kramerbooks, but the WAMU team is working with the team here on events because, well, we know that listeners are also readers. And tonight, we're here, as you heard, to talk with Randy Roberts about Blood Brothers. He and I will get the conversation rolling and move to a question and answer session with you after we have talked for a little while. But first, Randy Roberts, welcome.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
And I am happy to be here with you. First, what got you started on looking at this? You have written about sports stars and sports legends before, but this, as far as I can see, is the first time you looked at this combustible mix of sports and politics in a relationship.
Well, I have looked at relationships before. I did a book earlier on Joe Namath and Bear Bryant, so I looked at a relationship. I started with the idea that I wanted to write a book about Muhammad Ali. And I was writing the book. This book was co-written with Johnny Smith, so I want to give him full credit for co-writing the book. Because, quite frankly, Muhammad Ali was my champion. Okay, if you like boxing, if you followed boxing, people that lived through the 1930s and the early 1940s, Joe Louis was their champion. And in the 1950s, Rocky Marciano was their champion. Or in the 1920s, it was Jack Dempsey. Well, if you lived through the 1960s and the 1970s, Muhammad Ali was your champion. In the ring, he was your champion. And what is even rarer, outside of the ring, he was my champion. And so I thought, wow, I'd like to write a book about that. And Johnny and I started to work on it, and the more we worked on it, the more we decided, you know, what's really interesting is how Cassius Marcellus Clay became Muhammad Ali. What went into that? And the more we looked at it, the more we realized it was Malcolm X. The Cassius Clay was almost inhabiting the mind of Malcolm X. And we decided, you know, that's an interesting story. It's a short period of time. we can look at it fully and deal with all the sources that we could dig up on it. And it's a moment that helps change American history. I think from that period, in the first half of the 1960s, there are three great black leaders: Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and improbably Cassius Marcellus Clay.
Who later became Muhammad Ali.
Right.
I was a teenager growing up in Guyana, South America, and we sent boxers to the Olympics in Rome in 1960. One of the boxers we sent there, even though he got knocked out in the first round of his fight, somehow he managed to get a photograph of himself and the eventual winner of the light heavyweight division at those Olympics. The winner in that division at that Olympics was who?
It was Cassius Marcellus Clay. And quite frankly, it wouldn't be hard to get your picture with Cassius Clay. He met everybody. He was every place in the Olympics. There was one article we read that I remember reading. And one of the things that the athletes in the games did is they exchanged pins. And the New York Times said the official winner of exchanging pins in the Olympics was Cassius Marcellus Clay. For an athlete to expend an enormous amount of energy running around the Olympic Village, running around Rome, meeting everybody, accepting every interview, it probably wasn't a good thing to do, other than he won the gold medal, so he couldn't do any better than that.
But when we looked at the photograph, what we saw was this unbelievably handsome young man. And as you said, he accomplished all of this at the Olympics, and he had what for us was the unusual name of Cassius Marcellus Clay. We discovered that his brother was named Rudolph Valentino Clay. And so it all started in a way with their father. What we did not understand at the time was that they had not led the lives that Cassius's appearance would have led you to believe that they led. They had a much rougher upbringing, and the consciousness about the relationship between black and white people started with his father. Talk about that.
No question about it. And that is, his father, by the same name, Cassius Marcellus Clay, was a sign painter and an artist. You can still go to black churches in Louisville and you can see signs of his work. He believed that he was a great artist. Okay. He also believed he was a great singer. And he would break out in a song. I've listened to interviews that are in archive collections and interviews of the father. And he would break into a song and he would talk about how good of a singer he is and what a great artist he was. And he was destined, in his own mind, to be famous. He was Michelangelo, Frank Sinatra, though he said Frank Sinatra was a pathetic singer. I can't go along with that. Dean Martin he gave higher marks to. But anyway, he thought he was going to be, but he was kept down. His career was stunted because he was black. And it was a theme he talked about with his sons all the time. Not sometimes, but all the time. Oppression of whites. He grew up, both of them, in a segregated section of Louisville. And Cassius learned early that you stayed away from white people. Okay? That if you interact with white people, it can do you no good. Harm's going to come from it. The one thing, I interviewed one person from Louisville who was a friend of Cassius when Cassius was younger, and he talked about the lessons that they learned, what their parents told them. Don't go here, don't go here, don't do this, don't do that. Number one, don't get arrested. Because if you go to jail, we can't protect you. There's nothing we can do. Danger will come of it. I think about that. I mean, we're living through what seems to be an unprecedented plague of black kids being murdered. Murder is too strong of a word, but being shot by policemen, and maybe there was some truth to it.
That's what his parents were warning him against. But it also helps to explain why, despite the fact that he was able to charm everyone around him, why, despite the fact that he was doing so very well as a boxer, he became attracted to the Nation of Islam. He started going to Nation of Islam meetings. Why? How come?
Well, remember, let's look at. He was born in 1942. Okay. He was about the same age as Emmett Till. He remembered the murder of Emmett Till. His father talked about Emmett Till all the time, who was down in Money, Mississippi, I think, and was taken by several white men for supposedly wolf whistling a white woman. Probably didn't. Emmett Till had a stuttering problem. I don't know if you know the story of Emmett Till, but he had trouble saying certain letters. And he used to kind of whistle because it would put his mouth in a position where he wouldn't stutter. Maybe that was what happened. But anyway, for whatever he did, he ends up dead. And Muhammad heard this over and over. Also in Muhammad's neighborhood, there was a family that moved just a few blocks away into a black neighborhood. And their house was firebombed. So he felt, you know, he wasn't interested in integration. Okay, he wasn't part of the advancement, National Association advancement. He believed in separation of races, and so obviously the Nation of Islam appealed to him.
He and his brother Rudolph started going in the back door at meetings of the Nation of Islam when he was in locations where he had a fight or some other event. He was obviously attracted to the nation, and ultimately he would meet Malcolm X and be attracted to Malcolm X, and Malcolm X would also be very, very interested in who was then Cassius Clay. But as things have evolved in popular culture, they were during a time when, as you know, there was a dispute between Malcolm and Dr. Martin Luther King about what the best way forward was. But when we look at popular culture today, or when I look at popular culture today, here's what I noticed. There was a movie, a popular feature film made about Malcolm X. There was a popular feature film made about Ali. And it wasn't until the last 2 years that there was a feature film that was made not about Dr. King, but about his role in Selma. What has emerged from that era is that the most charismatic figures of that era turned out to be Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, who now capture the popular imagination. Why do you think that was? Charisma?
Partly charisma, though, my goodness. I mean, Martin Luther King had charisma. His speaking ability was non-parallel. I think Malcolm and Cassius, Muhammad Ali, had a harder edge to them. You know, they weren't compliant. They were tougher. They were stronger. You know, they didn't preach turning the other cheek. Okay, as Malcolm once said, you know, you shoot my dog, you better watch out for your cat. Okay, you know, he was going to come after. It was going to be an eye for an eye, and a boxer has that same sort of defiance. So maybe it's that.
Well, it also seemed to me that it was in part because of their relationship, and in part because both of them at one period were hated. People forget that there was a time when both Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali were hated because of their relationship with the Nation of Islam.
You're absolutely right on that. You know, I'm dealing with a time where Muhammad Ali was probably the most hated athlete in American history. Now, that will change. His stand on the Vietnam War, he never changes. America will change, but at the time I'm dealing with, he is absolutely hated. And of course, Malcolm X was the most hated black leader, the most hated politician in America. I mean, this is a person when the President of the United States was assassinated. Only about a week later, Malcolm X said, well, as far as he was concerned, it was chickens coming home to roost, that America's violence was being revisited upon America.
So Cassius Clay gets interested in the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X is the minister in the mosque in New York. How do the two meet?
Cassius went to train in Miami. And when he was in Miami, he started to attend some nation meetings. And he met a person who became kind of a tutor for him in Miami, a man by the name of Captain Sam Saxton. And Captain Sam told him the theology of the Nation of Islam and the leaders, and they talked about different aspects of the nation. But one time when Cassius was back home in Louisville, he got a call from Captain Sam. Captain Sam, this was in June of 1962. Captain said, there's going to be a rally, a Nation of Islam rally in Detroit. And why don't you come? I'll come pick you up. We'll drive up to Detroit, and you can meet Malcolm X. And Malcolm was the spokesman for the Nation of Islam. He was by far the most famous figure in the Nation of Islam. And Cassius said, that's fine. So they went to a luncheonette before the rally. And there, sort of shaped like this, but sitting in the back at a table, facing the door, where he always sat, back, facing the door, was Malcolm X. And Cassius goes up and says, hello, my name's Cassius Clay. Smiles. God, was he handsome. And Malcolm sees this dignified, strong, powerful man, but he has no idea who Cassius Clay is. He's never heard of Cassius Clay. He doesn't follow boxing. He just sees a very impressive, very seemingly charismatic man. But he picked up boxing. He learned it.
The Nation of Islam at that point did not allow its members to participate in what they call sport and play. So why was it that despite the fact that this guy had a profession in sport and play as a boxer, did Malcolm X see something there that he thought needed to be developed?
That's an excellent question. By that time, Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, who was the head of the Nation of Islam, were starting to split apart. There was a power struggle. Who's going to succeed Elijah Muhammad? Elijah Muhammad was older. His health was bad. He had been in Chicago, but he was living mostly in Phoenix at this time. And there was a sense that maybe Malcolm was too powerful. So there was a division taking place. And Malcolm was beginning to chafe under the constraints of the Nation of Islam. He wasn't allowed to do. Malcolm wanted to become more active in the struggle, and Elijah Muhammad said, "No, you stay away from it. Okay, we do not deal with members of the NAACP. You stay away from King. We're our own separatist organization." And this wasn't enough for Malcolm, and so I think in the back of his mind, the germ was taking shape that he was going to start his own organization someday. And he could see the charisma of this person, that athletes could have a potential political use.
He had charisma. He talked all the time. He never seemed to listen, but he listened very closely to Malcolm. Why? Was this outgoing, talkative person the real Cassius Clay?
That's several questions there. Let me first say, who knows who the real Cassius Clay was? This is a person that he was the most wonderful mimic possible. He could inhabit another person. So one person said of Cassius Clay, in fact, I've heard this from several persons, if you said something he liked, the next day he would say it. And the third day he would say it better than you said it, and he would think it was his. Okay? I mean, and he could become whoever he wanted to become. There's a poem that I like, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and I bet you have a copy of Eliot's J. But in that, there's this one line where the poet is going towards an assignation. And he's talking about there will be time to prepare the face, to meet the faces that you meet. Okay, the idea is, who is he? Maybe we're a bunch of different people. I mean, we're one person with friends, we're another person with colleagues, we're another person with, we're a succession. Well, this is the way Cassius was. In the Rome Olympics, for example, he was a representative of America, a defender of America. When a Russian reporter asked him about racism in America, he said, "Oh, don't worry about that. We've got important people taking care of that." Okay, it may be hard for me to get a dinner sometimes in the District of Columbia. He didn't say the District of Columbia, but he could have said the District of Columbia. But it's getting taken care of, and America's still the best country ever, including yours, Russian. Okay, that's one phase. Then he turns professional. There was a moment, aha moment. He had a fight in Las Vegas. And he was interviewed early in the morning by a radio. And also fighting in Las Vegas at that time in a wrestling match was a guy by the name of Gorgeous George. And so they're both there early in the morning, and the interviewer turns to Muhammad first, Cassius Clay at this time, and says, "Cassius, how are you going to do in the fight?" Cassius says, "I'm going to win the fight. I'm very confident. I've trained. I'm in shape. My opponent's good. It's going to be a good fight. I encourage everybody to come out and watch the fight. It's going to be a good fight, but I'm going to win." Then he turns to Gorgeous George, and he says, "Gorgeous, whatever you call him, how are you going to do it?" "I'm going to murder him. I'm going to rip off his arm. I'm going to tear out his... If I lose, I will crawl across the ring on my knees. I will kiss his feet. I will ask for forgiveness." And Cassius went, "Wow. I'd like to see that fight." Okay? So it suddenly was born the Louisville Lip. That's another Cassius Clay. And then we have other... So I forgot the original question.
He realized that was a performance that could enhance his career, and so he developed that performance. But in fact, he was a young man looking for knowledge.
Oh, back to Malcolm, okay.
And that's what he found that Malcolm X was able to provide. And so it turns out that this young man just listened very carefully to everything Malcolm X told him.
He had never seen a man so strong, so proud, and so outspoken. He said after meeting Malcolm for the first time, he said, "How can a black man say that and not get shot?" Okay? He couldn't understand it, that this guy would speak his mind in such a forceful manner, and that strength appealed to him, I think.
That strength appealed to him. The religion appealed to him. Elijah Muhammad appealed to him, but his relationship with Malcolm was so close. And you're going to have to read the book to find out a lot of the details of all of these fights. But at the most crucial fight in his life, the heavyweight championship fight against Sonny Liston, is when the relationship with Malcolm became closer than ever. Why?
Cassius Clay, in February of 1964, was fighting the most fearsome man in Christendom, or beyond Christendom, Sonny Liston. Sonny Liston was Joe Louis, Mike Tyson, and every tough fighter you can imagine. An ex-con, just tough. He had won he had won the title in his first defense, both with one-round knockouts. It was assumed he was going to end Cassius Clay's career.
If not his life.
If not his life. I interviewed one reporter for the fight, Robert Lipsyte. And Bob told me, he said, "Look, when I was sent down there as a young reporter for the New York Times to cover the fight, his seniors at the time said, 'Okay, here's what we want you to do, kid. You're going to cover the fight,' because they're not going to send a top-notch reporter because it's only going to last a few seconds. So they said to Lipsyte, 'Look, you go down. Here's what we want you to do. When you get down there, number one, find the fastest way from the arena to the nearest hospital, okay? Because we want you to get there first to be able to interview Cassius Clay, or to, when they pronounce him dead, to report on this.' And so he goes down and he does it. So Everybody thinks every reporter thinks he's going to lose. Everybody feels that he's afraid of Liston, that this kid will not last. But Malcolm gave him strength. Malcolm said, look, Allah has not brought you to this point for you to lose. This is ordained. You are part of Allah's plan for America, for the world. You are going to win. This is a battle between the crescent and the cross. And before he came to, Malcolm came to the dressing room, and they got down and they prayed together. And of course, if you've ever been in the bowels of a big auditorium and tried to find out where exactly is east, okay, if you want to pray to east, which way is east? Right? They did the best they could. It was. And Malcolm said, this is the crescent and the cross.
What is crucial also you find out in this book is that this was the time, as you pointed out, that Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad were drifting apart. And until I read this book, I didn't know that not even Elijah Muhammad and his sons in Chicago really believed that Cassius Clay would win this fight. Malcolm, it would appear, was the only person who, in the Nation of Islam, believed that he was going to win.
Oh, I'm certain that's true. Cassius, I think, maybe had an inkling that he could win. He had a plan for winning. But as Mike Tyson once said, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the face. Okay, and then plans go out the window. It's what's B option? My nose is bleeding. But yeah, he had a belief. But by this time, Malcolm has been silenced by the nation.
Why?
He's silenced because, remember,
the remark you mentioned earlier.
We're talking November. November 22nd, right? Kennedy was assassinated. And so we're talking about a fight that is now February 25th. So we're just a few months away from that. America's just coming out of its mourning. One of the great stories also, it talks about a kind of a pivot in our culture at that time. But Muhammad was introduced to 4 white Brits that he had never really heard of. They were the Beatles. Okay, so here we have the Beatles and still Cassius Clay dealing with each other before the fight. It's almost you can foresee the direction of our American popular culture.
You say the two of them were the two most important cultural phenomena of the 1960s: the Beatles and who was then Cassius Clay.
Well, that's my opinion, but I don't think anybody's going to, you're not going to convince me they weren't the two most important.
Well, at this point, Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad are having their differences. Why? Not only because Malcolm wanted to become more politically active, but because he was becoming disillusioned with Elijah Muhammad at the time. And Elijah Muhammad, having suspended him, was livid at him. But when Cassius Clay wins the fight, these two men are very close together. What pulls them apart?
What pulls Cassius and Malcolm?
Yes.
Now suddenly the Nation of Islam is embracing him. Brother, we knew you were going to win that fight, okay? We know. We didn't say anything. We didn't want to jinx it, but we knew it all along that you were going to win the fight. Malcolm is going another direction. Elijah Muhammad doesn't care about Malcolm leaving. Okay, that's a foregone conclusion. But he wants Cassius Clay in the organization. Now, Cassius Clay, imagine you've been mentored by a man who, when he says anything to you, begins it with the phrase, "The Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches." Okay, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says that the source of all wisdom, the source of all power, of Malcolm's power, of Ali's power, comes from Elijah Muhammad. But now Malcolm says, you know, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is a hypocrite. Okay? He's not practicing what he's preaching. He's doing all these things wrong. What does Clays to think? Well, have you been lying to me all these years? You know, I'm not sure I believe that. Okay? Also, Malcolm is venturing out into very dangerous territory. Because if you leave the Nation of Islam at that time, bad things could happen to you. Okay? And members of the nation are saying to Cassius, look, Malcolm will get what's coming to him. The chickens will come home to roost again. And so what's he going to do? He really plays it safe. He stays with, and then finally Elijah Muhammad gives him his name.
Malcolm wanted him to have another name.
Well, his first name was Cassius X.
Correct.
And the X stood for, the nation believed that your last name was your slave name, a black's last name. So what you did is you got rid of your last name and you used X. X symbolized your lost African culture. And that's why you had Malcolm X and Leon X and Louis Farrakhan at that time
was Louis X.
Was Louis X, exactly.
But when Elijah Muhammad gave him the name Muhammad Ali, psychologically, I guess, Malcolm knew he had lost him, didn't he?
Malcolm was listening to the sermon when the name was given to him. He was in a car. And when he heard it, Malcolm said, that's political. That's political. And he realized he had lost him.
And once he had lost him and he had also lost the Nation of Islam, their paths veered away from one another. And he tried and tried to see Muhammad Ali and couldn't see him. And then after he broke from the Nation of Islam, he went to Africa, to Ghana. He had become more international in his outlook. What happened in Ghana?
The last time that Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X saw each other was in Ghana, was in Accra, Ghana, outside of the Ambassador Hotel. It was totally by a coincidence. Malcolm was leaving, Cassius was arriving. And I might say in Africa is when Ali starts to think of himself as the king of the world, but Malcolm, throughout his visit in Africa, people sometimes confused him with Muhammad Ali and would come up to him and he said, no, I'm not Malcolm. I'm not Muhammad. And he would pull out a picture of him and Muhammad. He said, this is Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion. This is my friend, my very good friend. So Malcolm still loved Ali, still cared about him, still considered them friends. And when he saw Muhammad Ali, he started to say, Muhammad, brother Muhammad. And he started going to him. And Ali looked at him, looked dead in his eyes, just darts coming out, and said, you shouldn't have said that about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and turns around and walks away. And Maya Angelou was with Malcolm at the time.
She was driving him in her little Fiat.
She was. And she said that Malcolm said, I've lost a lot, maybe too much. It broke him. It almost broke him.
And we all know what happened after that, ultimately with Malcolm X, but in the case of Muhammad Ali, he stayed in the Nation of Islam for another maybe decade or so.
Yeah, in 1975, after Elijah Muhammad dies, he follows Wallace Muhammad, who moves the nation into a more orthodox Islamic direction.
And so he becomes a more orthodox Muslim.
Right.
A couple of things about the book. First, the title. Why is it called Blood Brothers?
Several people said they were like brothers. Okay? And that's certainly part of it. One person even said they were like blood brothers. But beyond that, we're dealing with blood as a leitmotif throughout this book. Boxing is a sport of blood. Politics at this time was a sport of blood. This is a time of assassination. This was a violent time for America. And we were trying to get that sense of the violence of America, and yet how do you maintain a relationship between two powerful people during that time?
We're almost about the point where we're going to take questions from you, so if you have a question, simply raise your hands and we will come to you. The other thing that fascinated me about the book is the cover. I have never seen Malcolm X look this playful before. He's looking down at Muhammad Ali with a camera in his left hand. He has his hand on Muhammad Ali's shoulder. Muhammad Ali's looking over his shoulder as if he's trying to figure out, is this the same serious leader that I've known so far? Why is he looking so playful?
Because they were playing with each other at that time. They were celebrating. That was taken the night right after Cassius Clay won the heavyweight championship of the world. And instead of going to the Fontainebleau Hotel, big famous hotel in Miami, they went back where there was supposed to be a big celebration for Clay. The problem with the celebration is nobody really had planned one because everybody thought he was going to lose. So they had to kind of throw it together at the last second. But that's where his white sponsoring, Louisville sponsoring group went. But he went, and Malcolm went back to the Hampton House, a black hotel in the black section of Miami. And they were playing around and joking and, just smiling at each other and mugging, and Malcolm was taking pictures all along this thing. But the interesting thing is they get serious and they go up to Malcolm's room and they're talking, and they're also in the room was Jimmy Brown,
Jim Brown,
the great football player, and Sam Cooke was there too, the great singer. A change is going to come. Mm-hmm. Change is going to come. And at one point, Malcolm leaves the room, and Cassius says to Jimmy Brown, I maybe leave, this might be it for the last dance for me and Malcolm, okay? We may be forced apart.
He didn't confide that to Malcolm, he confided it
to Jimmy Brown.
And we all know ultimately that Malcolm was assassinated. But by 1996, when Muhammad Ali at the Olympics in Atlanta was carrying the torch for the United States, he had become the most beloved athlete in the United States. From a period when people were rooting for Sonny Liston against him because of his religious beliefs. His religious beliefs never changed. He's still a Muslim to this day. What changed that caused Muhammad Ali to become so beloved?
He took a controversial stand, several things, but one is he took a controversial stand on Vietnam, which was incredibly unpopular when he took it, 1966 or so, but by the time, after a few years, it became mainstream. So he was seen as kind of a martyr for the anti-war cause. Also, he became debilitated, okay? He lost that sharp verbal gift. He lost that power that he once had. And maybe a third thing is it may say something about the power of American popular culture to absorb dissidents. We've made wallpaper out of the Eldridge Cleaver and the Black Panthers. So we're able to absorb.
All right, if you have any questions, now is the time to raise your hand. Yes, you, sir.
First of all, thank you both. I'm a big fan of yours, Kojo. Thank you, Mr. Rouse, for being here. I know when you approach a project where you're writing something historical, there's a lot of research and it's an investigative process. And you probably had some perspectives before you started writing this. As you went through the process and then at the conclusion of it, did you have any perspectives that you felt were changed by the process of actually going through about either thing?
Were you changed during the course of writing this book? Was your point of view on anything altered as a result of the process of writing this book?
Well, first of all, we wrote acknowledgments for the book, all the people that have helped us writing the book and the research. And I realize now that there was one person I didn't thank, and that was J. Edgar Hoover. Because without J. Edgar Hoover's obsession with investigating every black man in America that expressed a controversial opinion, I wouldn't have had all these wonderfully redacted documents to look at. Because anything that was taking place in the Nation of Islam, there could be 4 leaders in the room talking about important decisions, and one of them was working for the FBI. I have my guesses on which one it was, but I won't go into that. But what surprised me is I thought I knew who Muhammad Ali was. And he turned out to be a much more mercurial person than I ever expected. One person interviewed talked about it. He's figuring out Muhammad Ali is like figuring out a parlor game. Okay, there's just so many different facets of this personality, and to me, he was endlessly interesting.
Anyone else? Question? Just raise your hand. Here's another.
You had mentioned that Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, had a separatist view before he came to the nation. So when W.D. Muhammad switched to a more orthodox Islam that would embrace white people's Muslims too, was that difficult a transition for Muhammad Ali? And what was his relation to Louis Farrakhan? Was he at all tempted to join Louis Farrakhan's reconstituted Nation of Islam?
You mentioned that Muhammad Ali had separatist views before he joined the Nation of Islam. So when Elijah Muhammad's son, Wallace D. Muhammad, decided to take the nation in a direction of Orthodox Islam, why did Muhammad Ali choose to go with him as opposed to going with Louis Farrakhan?
I don't think he had any problems going that direction. In many ways, he had always lived in an integrated world. His first sponsoring group were whites. His manager, his trainer, Angelo Dundee, throughout his career was white. He had many white friends. And so I think he was actually more comfortable. And in some ways, he was moving the direction that Malcolm had started to move when Malcolm was assassinated. So no, there was never any reservations that I was able to ascertain.
But he talked about the process of writing this book. This is, as far as I know, the first book that you have had a co-author on. How was that process for you, working with a co-author?
Actually, I've worked on a co-author with several books.
My bad.
It's okay. Though you probably have heard me give interviews before. I usually take all the credit. No, I love, if it's the right co-author, it's a little bit like a marriage, okay? If it's the right wife, it really works out well. If it's not the right wife, okay, it doesn't work out as well. No, I like it, because when you're writing a book, it's an intensely solitary thing. And, even your family, they pretend like they're sort of interested in what you're doing, but they're really not, okay? They may be able to take a minute or two, It's like talking about, listening to other people talk about their children, Give me the brief version. But when you have a co-author, you're both interested in it, okay? You go on research. When you go on a research trip, they can be really kind of boring. I mean, you spend your time all day long in the archive, then you're sort of alone at night. But when you're going with somebody else, you're talking about it, you're working through problems together. And my co-author, Johnny Smith, was just a fabulous co-author. And we learned to complete each other's sentences, trying to figure it out, trying to piece this puzzle together. So I recommend co-authors. I think it's great.
How long did the process take for you? When did you first conceive, after thinking about a book about Muhammad Ali, then deciding that it was going to be a book about the relationship between him and Malcolm X? How long after that did it take for you to get it all together?
I would say probably from the time we really started hard work, because academics spend a lot of time just thinking about and not doing anything, okay? You know, drinking coffee, I don't drink coffee, but I should drink coffee. But, you know, but once I really started, maybe about 2.5 years from the time, maybe 3 years from the time we really started to do hardcore research till the book was finished.
Any other questions here? You, sir?
I think I'm from the Caribbean, and I grew up at a time when, especially my father generation and stuff like that, those are the people who got me interested in Ali. I remember when he lost his fight against...
You're describing my generation.
You might be a little bit older than me, but we are so close, we're the same generation. But I remember when he lost the fight, they take me to see when he lost the fight against Joe Louis, right? These are men who are not emotional people, and practically you could hear people crying. But so my relationship with him goes back a long time. I like to believe that. But there are three interesting things that it seem to me to be talking about here. And one of them is the issue of who is Muhammad Ali, right? He's a he's basically kind of, I don't want to overdo this now, but he's basically like Jesus Christ, right? He can mix and match to all type of changes in the society, right? Uh-huh. If you come to this, oh, that's Ali. Oh, well, yes, but, how do you think in that multi-dimensional, flexible situation that he identity-wise facing, right? At a time when African Americans are massively protesting in the civil rights movement, right? Demanding, change, etc. Women are demanding change. You have the beginning of the Vietnam War, right? What is interesting, you didn't touch on it, is the fact that who I'm talking about, the other black leader, the other important black leader instead of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, right? Vietnam speech, right? Well, Ali reflects the Vietnam speech very quickly, right? By deciding, I'm not doing this. No Vietnamese killed me. No Vietnamese, I'm not going, right? But all of this was tremendously controversial. So how do you see all of these changes, right, reflect into this kind of a character who himself is kind of trying to figure out where he stands against all of these multi-layer changes taking place, and maybe then the complexity to try to define who he is at the ultimate end of the day.
Muhammad Ali was a multifaceted, complex man living in multifaceted, complex times. How did he negotiate his way through those times?
I'm not sure he spent a lot of time thinking about it. Okay, he just moved forward. Okay, and he took every hurdle as it came. He's in some ways was a paradoxical person. He's a person that kind of represents today kind of peace and love and fellowship and brotherhood. But I know people that have talked to him and said he was a wonderful person to be around, but he would never really ask questions about somebody else. Okay, I mean he just kept moving forward, and it's almost as if he picked up reflections from the society, and we partially created the Muhammad Ali that we wanted to believe was there. I don't think he was working on it that much.
But he took a major financial hit by refusing the draft. He lost his career for many, many years. What gave him the strength and the fortitude to withstand that?
Several things. Number one, I don't think money mattered to him at all. Okay, he wasn't in anything for money. Michael Jordan, when he was asked to be involved in a controversial political campaign, he said, hey, Republicans buy Nikes too. Okay, he didn't want to do it. Muhammad Ali refused to be fenced in. Money wasn't important to him. Therefore, after winning the heavyweight championship, the next day he gave a Declaration of Independence speech where he says, look, I don't have to be who you want me to be. I'm free to be who I want to be. To me that resonates with, we just went through the Super Bowl and Beyonce, and everybody's criticizing, oh, well, why did she sing that song? Why didn't she sing, put a ring on the finger or something like that. You're right, you know? That's my Beyonce. Okay. It's pretty weak.
It's a pretty good impression.
But, you know, it's, you know, to me, this is great to see that, you know, that she's saying, hey, you picked me for the Super Bowl. Okay, you want me for your agenda? Fine. I'm going to use it for my agenda. Okay, and if it costs me an endorsement, okay, I'm only worth $1.5 billion instead of $1.6 billion. Okay, I can live with it.
Not going to be who you want me to be. You have a follow. Oh, here's this young lady.
Totally separate. Going back to when you were starting to write the book, you said originally you were going to write a book about Muhammad Ali. Were you going to write the book about Muhammad Ali with a co-author?
Yes.
Or did it change? Okay.
No, I was going to do it with the co-author. And this isn't unusual where you start a book and at first you see it this way, and then, you know, by the time you realize, no, this is the book that I want to write. That's not that unusual. It's happened a few times to me.
But you were writing about a period during which, as you pointed out, there was a great deal of conflict, assassinations were taking place, there was a lot of violence, and in the relationship, the deteriorating relationship between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, it was a very scary time. So I'm wondering, in writing the book, the people you talked to about that period, were there still people who were reluctant to talk to you about what went on during that period? Or has enough time passed so that people were willing to be frank and open about everything that happened? Because a lot happened.
Most of the people that were in any position to know what was going on
are gone.
But, for example, Captain Sam is still around. We talked with Captain Sam, and he was a wonderful interview. And he would still hold pretty hard views towards Malcolm, I think would be safe to say. I mean, time hasn't softened all the edges.
In this case, did you attempt to interview Minister Louis Farrakhan at all?
We attempted, but we were unsuccessful.
Yes, the book does point out that in very many ways, Louis X, as he was then called, was chosen by Elijah Muhammad in many ways to replace Malcolm X, correct?
Well, but the main replacement in terms of as a recruiting, and that they used all the time in the Muhammad Speaks, their newspaper, was Muhammad Ali himself.
You had a follow-up? Oh, you had a follow-up. Go ahead.
What were Muhammad Ali's experiences with Christianity growing up, and did that influence his decision to become a member of the nation?
He had a typical Southern black experience with Christianity. His mother was a good Baptist. He went to church. No, I don't think it did. I think probably his father influenced it, and his experience influenced the separatism. And that's what he really liked about it, is this idea of separatism. But you couldn't have told it from his upbringing. Pretty traditional.
Yes, sir.
Talk about, did you use the FOIA laws to do your research?
Did you use FOIA laws to get any of your information?
Some, but most of the information, most of the main files we looked at had already been declassified. For example, Elijah Muhammad's file, Malcolm X's file, some of the other lieutenants' files, and also police files in New York. So most of them have already been declassified, and a lot of them you can get online. The hard thing about using those is that they're so redacted that unless we knew where the two characters were day by day. And that helped us to see when they were close to each other, and it helped us kind of provide a key to decipher what the documents were saying. Because if you look at an FBI document, it's, dedact, 5 words, dedact. But we were able to get a great deal out of them. Johnny was a master at it.
One more.
We only have time for one more question. My Caribbean brother, try to make it brief.
Well, 2 questions.
Make them both brief then.
The first one is, obviously, Muhammad was stopped fighting at the very top point of his career. I mean, in many ways, he lost the very best years of, in all probability, a career that was going to be even more magnificent than it ended up being. That's the first thing. The second thing, obviously, being stopped by a white power structure at that time who he was challenging vis-a-vis Vietnam. Did you see that play out in a way, for example, towards how African Americans saw him, how the Black Panthers saw him, etc., etc.? Do you see that as radicalizing in a certain way the civil rights movement and black people towards the white power structure at that point in time, or you didn't see that?
Did you see Muhammad Ali's actions having a radicalizing effect on the black power structure and I guess the civil rights movement?
I don't know about radicalizing. It was radicalized. I see him as he became the patron saint of liberal leftist causes. There was one great image, and it was in a cover of Esquire magazine, where they showed him in his boxing gear, stretched out with arrows through him. Obviously a takeoff from the famous painting of Saint Sebastian, but he was a martyr for the cause, yes.
And I'm afraid that's going to have to about wrap it up. What's your next book? Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio?
I'm a Trump man. What can I say? No, something should be done. I mean, we talk about celebrity, and now celebrity's taking over politics. So we'll see.
We'll see. It's going to be a boxing match, all right. A few words about WMU as we wrap up and Randy gets ready to sign your books. For those who are not familiar, we are the NPR news station, WMU is, in the District of Columbia. But more importantly, we are your public radio station in this region. You can find us anytime at 88.5 on your FM radio dial or at WAMU.org or via the NPR One app on your smartphone. And if anyone is interested in talking about the station or radio generally, there are quite a few WAMU colleagues here in the audience. They're usually the ones with wine glasses in their hands. Sarah Cumby. And if you work at WMU, please raise your hand. We'd be happy to chat. And again, thank you all for coming out tonight. I had a good time. I would have paid for this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Kojo. Thank you all so much for coming. If you could do us a favor, help us by folding up your chair, placing it against the bookcase on the far wall. Please do come up, say hello, get a book, and have it signed. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
When I tune into it on the weekends, usually it's authors sharing their new releases.